Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm David Gura in for Joe Matthew. Tonight, lining up diplomatic wins in Asia. Financial markets are buoyed by the president's trip to Malaysia and Japan, hitting a fresh record to start the week as the White House promotes key agreements on the first days of Trump's visit. Still, the devil is in the details, and both the financial world and Washington await the president's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. We'll discuss the developments and what's on their agenda with Nicholas Burns, the former U.S. ambassador to China. We'll get into how the uncertainty of the president's trade policy is impacting American small businesses with Small Business Administrator Kelly Loeffler. Also tonight, the largest union representing federal workers is backing a clean continuing resolution. It's calling on Congress to reopen the government. Will that put pressure on Senate Democrats to vote in favor of the Republicans' plan? We'll speak with Michigan Senator Gary Peters, a Democrat, on that and more. And some news that just came out a few minutes ago. NextEra Energy is now planning to restart a nuclear power plant in Iowa, primarily to supply Google data centers. When it's expected to be operational, up ahead. And finally, did the country just see the emergence of the new standard bearers of the Democratic Party? The thunderous rally held by Zoran Mamdani with Senator Bernie Sanders and Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. What that says about the future for Democrats. But we begin tonight with President Trump's trip to Asia, where President Trump has a full slate of meetings, including one with the new Japanese Prime Minister just a few hours from now. However, the world is keeping a close watch on the president's much-anticipated meeting with China's President Xi Jinping, scheduled to take place on Thursday of this week. While they're set to sit down in South Korea, negotiators have already set up a wide-ranging agreement for them to finalize, even though early indications are the trade deal offers more of a temporary ceasefire than a full armistice between the world's two largest economies. For the latest on this visit, we turn now to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who joins us live from Tokyo. Tyler, get us up to speed here. As I say, the first leg of this trip was to Malaysia. There was a much ballyhooed agreement by the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. He and Jamieson Greer working ahead of the president's visit there to come up with this deal with their Chinese counterparts. They've set the table. What does it look like?
Yeah, hey, David. Good evening to you. Good morning where I am, where we've seen positive momentum from both sides, indicating that we will likely get an extension to the trade truce that's currently in place and set to expire on November 10th, really marking what feels like a stark contrast to the escalation in recent weeks. Now, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says that he and his trade counterparts have essentially teed up a framework for President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping to fortify and finalize when they meet later this week on Thursday. Now, the U.S. has effectively taken the threat of an additional 100% tariff off the table. In exchange, it appears, for Beijing delaying its planned unveiling of these new export curbs on critical and rare earth minerals set to be enforced on December 1st. The Treasury Secretary has also suggested that China will resume its purchases of U.S. soybeans, though we've yet to get any sort of indications on exactly how much and how quickly those purchases will take place and bring relief to U.S. farmers. There's a few other concessions that we've heard put on the table, including that China is saying that the U.S. will no longer impose fees on Chinese ships docked at American ports. And while the U.S. maintains it's not going to loosen any of its export curbs on advanced semiconductors, our own analysts at Bloomberg Economics say that they expect any threatened but not yet imposed restrictions to be taken off the table. That includes for critical software and some cloud computing. So a few different threads that we could really be following here, David, but really everything that I just outlined was newly unveiled leverage in the last few months. But that's why it is interesting to pick out that the negotiators on both sides have said that they've made progress when it comes to fentanyl. 20% of the tariff currently in place on China is related to fentanyl. So if we see any sort of movement on the rate there, that would be considered really significant. Now, David, of course, this is what's going forward and what we're expecting the leaders to discuss on Thursday. But importantly, we're seeing the White House shore up its position ahead of this meeting in the series of stops ahead of time. In Malaysia, President Trump signing some critical mineral deals, of course, geared towards trying to loosen China's grip on that market. And then here in Japan, we are expecting President Trump and the newly elected prime minister to have a series of discussions, including on defense and economic cooperation, all in a bid to counter China.
That's Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. They're reporting from Tokyo as the president's trip through Asia continues. Tyler, thank you very much. As the world awaits President Trump's meeting with China's President Xi Jinping, Wall Street is hoping that the two superpowers are nearing a trade deal. This optimism is helping to lift the riskier corners of the market, with stocks hitting all-time highs amid a rally in crypto as well. For all the details on the market action, we turn now to Bloomberg's Romain Bostic for Power Moves. Romain joins us live from world headquarters in New York. Romain, this started off early. After that deal was announced over the course of the weekend, what do we see in the trade today?
Yeah, I mean, to say that people are enthusiastic about this might be an understatement, David. We talk about record highs across the board for the major indices here in the United States. Meanwhile, you look at the chart on the screen behind me, some of the stocks that had benefited from a lot of those trade tensions, like the rare earths companies, like some of the mining companies, they took a leg down. And this really is about the idea of progress on trade. And remember, David, it's not just China. Remember, we had some relatively encouraging comments coming out of the president of Mexico, relatively encouraging comments coming out of the president of Brazil. And then, of course, there was the election victory, a midterm election victory in Argentina that also seemed to solidify a financial relationship between the United States and that country as well. And that's given investors maybe a little bit more clarity that some of these loose ends on trade could actually be tied up maybe sometime soon. Obviously, China is a big wild card, but the idea that you had that handshake agreement on issues like fentanyl, on issues like shipping fees, on issues, of course, like capital flows as well, and that is a big part of the reason why you saw the rally, David, here on this day.
Romain, there were a number of corporate stories that dovetailed with Washington over the course of the day. We're going to talk about Next Energy, that nuclear power deal, in just a moment. But let me ask you about Amazon. Over the course of the last week or so, there have been a number of stories about the way that Amazon has embraced artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean for the company's workforce. Get us up to speed on what we learned today.
Well, I mean, they announced about 30,000 job cuts in their corporate business. That's basically going to be about 10% of their corporate staffing here. Remember, this is a behemoth of a company here. So while that is a lot of workers potentially out of a job here, this is also a company that appears to be trying to right-size itself. The big question that I had, David, when I saw this headline and that I posed to a lot of our guests on the close was this idea that with all the spending that we're seeing on the AI infrastructure build out, is that potentially going to be at the expense of investments in other areas in the business, i.e., do they have to basically shed workers? At least from what we know publicly, there does not seem to be a direct connection between those two. But it is something, David, to keep an eye on, because we have seen other companies also announce job cuts heading towards the end of the year, much smaller in scale and scope than what we learned out of Amazon. But remember, when you're basically just throwing off billions, multiple $billion in cash, David, to fund this AI infrastructure build out, you might have to be a bit judicious about where you spend in other parts of the business.
There you go. Romain, thank you very much. That's Bloomberg's Romain Bostic joining us from New York. Well, ahead of Thursday's meeting, we want to turn now to Nicholas Burns, a former U.S. ambassador to China. He had that position during the Biden administration. He is now a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and joins us today from Cambridge. Ambassador Burns, thank you very much. It's always good to speak with you. And I want to start with how you are thinking about this meeting that's going to unfold on Thursday. There has been so much anticipation. There's the speculation of what might get out of it. How are you thinking about it, and what do you think the likely outcome is going to be?
Well, first, David, I think it's very positive that President Trump and President Xi are going to meet. They haven't met since 2019. And these are the two most powerful people in the world, two largest global economies, two most powerful militaries. And the U.S. and China are competing across a broad range of issues. And so very important that they have hours together to talk through these issues. They know each other very well. They had a pretty good working relationship during President Trump's first term. So in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, Xi Jinping decides everything in China of any importance. So you've got to meet with Xi Jinping to make progress, positive or negative, on all the issues on the agenda.
We have this framework deal announced by the Treasury Secretary, and it's something that the president addressed when he was making his way from Malaysia to Tokyo. Let's take a listen to what he had to say on Air Force One.
What we understood yesterday or 2 days ago or even today is not going to be necessarily what it's going to be in 2 days. I mean, we're going to have a great talk. I have a lot of respect for President Xi. I like him a lot. He likes me a lot, I believe, and respects me, and I think he respects our country a lot. And I think we're going to have a successful transaction for both countries.
A successful transaction there, the president said. There is so much left to be resolved during these talks and in subsequent talks, I imagine. What do you think is at the top of the agenda? What's kind of a reasonable deliverable or deliverables from this meeting?
Well, for the United States, and President Trump and Secretary Bessent have been very clear about this, China needs to help the United States on the fentanyl crisis because the majority of the precursor chemicals that go into the synthetic opioid come from the black market in China. So President Biden pushed President Xi on fentanyl, and President Trump appropriately has, and a commitment from the Chinese to be much more vigorous in cracking down on that black market, very important. Second, obviously, it looks like there's going to be some form of a announcement on the TikTok deal, another important issue. And third, I would say for the United States, agriculture, China's the largest market for American agricultural exports. 1/5 of all of our exports go to China. And the Chinese have been playing hardball since April, May. They have not bought a single dime worth of soybeans. To give you a point of comparison, David, 2 years ago, the Chinese bought $14 billion in U.S. soybeans. It's really hurt our farm community. So those are some of the issues up front that the United States has been demanding progress. I think President Trump has been right to be tough-minded because the Chinese have been serial violators of the international trade rules for decades now. So I think that'll be on the U.S. side. I fear, David, that the Chinese ask will be a relaxation or a suspension altogether of the U.S. export controls on advanced U.S. technology. 3 years ago, President Biden prohibited the sale of advanced semiconductors to China for AI purposes, and that was a good decision because that keeps that technology out of the hands of the People's Liberation Army, which is trying to compete with our military for power and influence in the Indo-Pacific. And I hope very much the Trump administration will say no to that relaxation of our export controls.
I spoke earlier today with Mick Mulvaney, the former congressman and former White House official, and he talked about the relationship between the U.S. and China. And just to summarize what he said, we used to have a Cold War. Maybe a useful way to think about this relationship today is one of a cold peace. Is that in line with how you view it, sir? What's the proper way to think about what this relationship is like today and, if these talks go successfully, the kind of relationship that we're looking at going forward?
Well, I think on trade, David, I think what we're seeing is really a truce as opposed to a formal 1,000-page document written by lawyers with enforcement mechanisms, a normal, maybe an old school trade deal. There might be 7 or 8 issues where they make commitments to each other, and it's good to make progress on these. But I think the tension between the United States on trade issues is going to continue past this meeting. That's not a criticism of President Trump. It's actually more criticism of the Chinese government and of the fact that they've been extraordinarily difficult on these issues. Overall, I'd say that, this is a very competitive U.S.-China relationship. That's the reality I lived as ambassador. That's the reality that President Trump and his team are now facing. We're competing for military power in the Indo-Pacific, and we don't want to be the second most powerful military, so we got to keep ahead of the Chinese. Increasingly, David, I think that the major issues revolve around AI, biotech, quantum computing, cyber, where China has been extraordinarily aggressive. And of course, we've got to empower our private sector to win those competitions. And we've talked about trade. And of course, we have opposite ideas between us and the Chinese leadership on human freedom and democracy and human rights. So I don't expect this rivalry structured around all those differences to change much. And that means that every American president and Congress has got to be really focused on competing with China and winning many of these competitions at the same time as we try to keep peace with China, which obviously we should do in a nuclear weapons world. This is a very difficult relationship to manage, and I hope for success when President Trump meets President Xi in a couple of days. American success.
We've got about a minute left here. You're watching this unfold from Cambridge, I from Washington, D.C. What's your counsel to somebody who's watching this in Taipei, in Taiwan, wondering about whether the independence of Taiwan is going to be up for negotiation here in this meeting or subsequent ones?
I certainly hope Taiwan will not be on the table because, American law, the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, and also just what's right for the United States and the people of Taiwan. We've been supporting them with defensive technology. We've been trying to tell the Chinese and hold the Chinese to a commitment that they agree to a peaceful resolution of this dispute. I don't think that should be a compromise at all in these talks, and I'd be very surprised if that was the case.
Ambassador Burns, thank you very much for your time, as always.
Thank you, David.
Burns,
Always a
former
pleasure.
U.S. Ambassador to China. Thank you again. He was the ambassador under the Biden administration, joining us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Coming up, how small businesses are feeling the weight of these ongoing trade negotiations with China. We're going to discuss that with Kelly Loeffler, the administrator of the SBA. That's up ahead. But first, how Democrats are strategizing amid this government shutdown that is now in its 5th week. Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan will join me next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
Now, every Republican in Congress wants to stop this madness desperately. And we have voted many times, over a dozen times, collectively 13 times, to reopen the government, to keep it open and reopen it once the Democrats closed it. But here's the very simple and important fact that no one should forget. We have no ability. Republicans do not have the ability to do this on our own. It's a simple math problem. We need Democrats to help.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. I'm David Gura. That, of course, was House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier today, offering an update to reporters on this, the 5th week of the federal government shutdown. We're now just 5 days away from when programs like SNAP will run out of funding. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, posting on its site, quote, "The well has run dry," warning that on November 1st, benefits will not go out, impacting more than 40 million Americans. Meanwhile, it's the president's trip to APEC, headlines over his war against cartels in South America, garnering a lot of attention back home here in the United States. Joining me now live from Capitol Hill is Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. He's the ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, also a member of both the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Commerce Committee. Senator, thank you very much for the time. And let's start with what we heard there from the House Speaker about Democrats and Republicans needing to come together. I note that Lisa Murkowski, the Democratic senator, senator from Alaska, speaking on the floor, calling upon colleagues to forego their paychecks. She said she'd be willing to do that, indicating that the Congress should not go out of session until all of this is handled. How likely is that? What's the quality of conversations that you're having among Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill?
Well, there's no question. We have to come together. We got to have substantive conversations. I find it's interesting. You have the speaker saying we have to come together, and yet none of his members are here in Washington. They're basically all back home on vacation. It's very difficult to have conversations when none of the House members are here working. I can say in the Senate, I've been actively engaged in conversations with many of my Republican colleagues, along with Democratic colleagues. We're going to continue to have those conversations. But quite frankly, we need to have leadership involved. And quite frankly, you're going to need Donald Trump. He's going to have to get engaged. I've worked with Republicans in the prior administration and currently. And even if you're negotiating with Republicans, unless Donald Trump signs off on it, they're not going to support things, even if they agree to it with us. I saw that in the last Trump administration. We had an agreement on border security legislation. Republicans said they agreed, and literally an hour before the vote came up on the Senate floor, Donald Trump said he wasn't for it, and all of the folks who shook my hand and said they were for it were no longer for it. So we've got to make sure that we can negotiate in a way with someone who can actually deliver when we come together to make sure that Americans have access to quality, affordable health care.
You've been back in Michigan. You're now returned to Washington, D.C., carrying with you, I imagine, comments and worries from your constituents about this shutdown. What do your constituents say to you about how it's affecting them and the prospects for them if this continues?
Well, certainly no one likes a shutdown. I don't like a shutdown. I think we should never have a shutdown. We should come together. And certainly, if you're the majority party, if you have the presidency, you have the Senate, and you have the House, you should do everything you can to bring people together to make sure that we can keep the government open. But I think folks also are very concerned about increases in health care costs. It is becoming increasingly unaffordable for more and more Americans, and we know the Affordable Care Act, when these tax credits, which have already expired, impact people. They're going to see it starting November 1st when they get their bills. Some people are going to see a doubling, a tripling of their cost. That's simply unaffordable. We know that people are now going to have to go without insurance. And we also know when people lose their insurance and they don't get on a plan, that ends up actually costing everybody, because then the cost of insurance goes up for folks. And we look at the people who are likely to lose insurance because of this large increase that we could avoid, which is what we want to do as Democrats, avoid these large increases in premiums. They tend to impact younger folks. And you got to have younger folks in the insurance pool to keep the insurance affordable for everybody. So this is a critical situation. Health insurance is something that I believe has to be affordable. It should be a right for Americans to be able to have the peace of mind to know that they have that kind of coverage. And all we're asking the Republicans is come forward. Let's talk this through. In fact, it's curious that if you look at the areas that are actually most impacted, the people who are going to see the largest increases in these healthcare costs tend to be Republican congressional districts and Republican states. So if they don't want to stand up for their own people, I know it's difficult to get them to stand up for others, but they're not even standing up for their own folks in their own districts and states.
Senator, let me ask you to change the subject here about what we've seen off the coasts of South America. You were in the Navy and you've watched as the Gerald Ford has been dispatched down there, is making its way to South America. As I say, you sit on the Armed Services Committee. How do you process what's happening with this military movement, this military maneuvering? What does it signal to you, and what questions do you have about the administration's objectives here?
Well, we have all sorts of questions. So as you mentioned, I serve in the Navy. I also serve on the Armed Services Committee. We have been asking for a briefing as to what is going on down there. We know that they have been destroying boats. What is engaged? Who is being engaged? How do you know who is on those boats? How do you know where they're going? You know, I'm the ranking member on Homeland Security. I want to stand firm to make sure that we don't allow illegal drugs into our country. That stuff is poison. We have to do everything we can to keep it out of our country. But we have ways to do that. I work closely with the U.S. Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security. But we always get information about those operations and what we need to do in order to keep our country safe. Right now, the administration has been radio silent. We don't know what is happening here. It's hard to comment. And when you go in and destroy a boat and kill folks, and we don't know who those people are or how they were identified, it raises a lot of serious questions. You know, the part of the moral authority we have as the United States is that we believe in the rule of law. We are a country of laws, and I believe that we have to continue to be a country based on the rule of law, and part of that is having the information to understand exactly what that military force is being used for. Congress has to be engaged in that. We know that Congress has the power under the United States Constitution to declare war, but in order to declare war, we have to understand exactly what that war is going to involve, what the purposes are, and how it's being carried out. And we're completely unable to do that right now because we have not received the information that, quite frankly, the Constitution demands of the executive to provide to the Congress.
And very quickly here, 10 seconds or so, have you gotten a response to requests for briefing from the administration?
Not yet. We've asked repeatedly and still have no response.
Gary Peters, the Democratic Senator from Michigan, thank you very much for the time on this Monday afternoon. I really appreciate it. Coming up here on Bloomberg Balance of Power, how President Trump's ongoing trade negotiations are impacting small businesses. Here in the United States, we're going to sit down with Kelly Loeffler, the administrator of the Small Business Administration. She's going to join me here on set in our headquarters right here on Bloomberg's Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio as we continue to follow the president's movements through Asia, just hours away from a highly anticipated meeting between the president of the United States and the prime minister of Japan. We'll see if they reopen the trade deal agreed to a few weeks ago between those two countries. That's coming up here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. I'm David Gura. Nvidia has spent the past 3 years ensnared in an escalating trade impasse between the U.S. and China. That's kept some of its prized artificial intelligence chips out of a crucial market, and it's cost the company billions of dollars in revenue. Now, the same week President Trump plans to meet with President Xi, Nvidia will hold one of its biggest AI conferences just blocks from the White House, a clear sign of how important Washington is to Nvidia, of course, the world's most valuable company. For all the details, we turn now to Ed Ludlow, host of Bloomberg Technology, who joins me live here in our Washington Bureau. Set the stage for us.
Yeah.
It was, for a time, a rare thing that a tech company would have a big event like this in Washington, D.C., maybe one that does a lot of defense or national security work. This is different. What can we expect as the company comes here?
You know, like either it's fortunate or unfortunate that the President of the United States is not here this week. You know, I think Nvidia and Jensen Huang would say that their access to the President is pretty clear and that, you know, Jensen has traveled with the President on multiple occasions this year. But you set the story up well, which is they are in D.C. for a reason. GTC is a developers conference. It's very technical. It's usually based on product. And so on the kind of company side of this story, it's a company that's told us what they're going to do for the next 5 years anyway. The unknown is its ability to access the China market. And the reality is that right now, considering both U.S. export controls as they stand, and China's role in this, China always has something to say, of course. You know, the reality is they've gone from 80% market share in AI data center to now 0%. And they still are waiting on some kind of definitive on how they proceed while the President negotiates that trade relationship.
Perhaps the only man who travels more than you is Jensen Huang, who I believe I was reading this weekend is making his way to Asia for meetings after all of this.
Right, so he will then go to the APEC CEO
And talk
Summit.
a bit about sort of what he hopes to get out of this. And you mentioned kind of the quality of the relationship between him and the President of the United States. How aligned are they in his hope that he will be able to sell some of these
What
chips to the
you've
Chinese
seen,
market?
actually, interestingly, out of the White House is that the language of some of those important around the President, take, for example, David Sachs, the AI czar, is very, very close to the language that Jensen Huang uses about that market. And the conclusion is that there's this sort of universal belief that it's better to sell and send a deprecated AI chip to China than none at all. Because that way you do not give them impetus to develop their own economy around AI chips, a domestic champion through Huawei. But also, if you think about the Middle East and Africa, those are great markets that China wants to sell in as well. So, you know, Jensen will do this event tomorrow, go on a plane at the end of the week to Asia. The same questions remain. What is the result of the President's negotiations with China? And does Nvidia, pardon the pun, you know, play a role as some sort of bargaining chip, deprecated AI chips in exchange for rare earths? And really, that is the conversation, the frank conversation that everyone here will have.
Very quickly here, I'm going to guess we're going to speak tomorrow, but as you kind of look at the list of who's going to participate in this conference, is a good analog like WWDC for Apple? Who are the companies that it's going to be meeting with, and what does that tell you?
So without contradicting myself, it is a developers conference, but the chairman of Foxconn will be there, for example, you know, critically important assembler, contract manufacturer of the iPhone. That's a pretty sure signal. CEOs from other companies are expected, from the data center supply chain. There are some senators that are speaking, but, you know, right now, obviously, you have a government shutdown. No prominent government officials. Well, many of them are actually with the President in Asia right now, you know, so that would make a lot of sense. That said, don't know what they're going to say or they're going to announce. So, you know, Nvidia's the golden ticket in AI. And typically how these things go is they say, we are partnering with XYZ company, and that company's stock goes up quite a lot if they're publicly traded. And it's realistic to think that might be the case this week.
Ed, good to talk to you. A treat to talk to you in person, which is a rare thing. Ed Ludlow is the host of Bloomberg Tech, joining me here in D.C. And you can catch a brand new episode tomorrow of Bloomberg Tech at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific on Bloomberg Television. Well, as you look ahead to President Trump's meeting with Japan's new prime minister on the sidelines of the APEC Summit, it's the number of diplomatic wins the White House is lining up and Trump's upcoming meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping later this week that are getting the most attention. Investors are cheering the announcements, but there is still a lot left unresolved. And the Chamber of Commerce says tariff uncertainty is costing small businesses in the U.S. upwards of $200 billion annually. Joining me now here in our Washington bureau is Kelly Loeffler. She's the head of the Small Business Administration and former Republican senator from Georgia. Great to have you with me. And let me just start there. We focus a lot on the effect that tariff uncertainty is having, trade policy uncertainty is having on some of these bigger companies. But for smaller businesses, what does it mean day in and day out?
Well, day in, day out, small business optimism is rising. We see it above its 52-year average, according to NFIB, and the U.S. Chamber has small business confidence at 7-year highs. And that's because of President Trump's economic agenda that has slashed taxes and regulations, that is promoting fair trade. So when I hear tariffs, I think for small businesses who've been so impacted by the hollowing out of America's productive capacity that it can come back onshore. And most manufacturers in America are small businesses. I'm on a national manufacturing tour right now. They are thrilled that President Trump believes in the American worker, in the American industry, and that he's bringing it back onshore. And that's why at the SBA, we've put out record capital in fiscal 25 that just wrapped up 27 days ago. And at all-time high for 72 years at the SBA, we put out $45 billion to 85,000 small businesses who have confidence in the future like never before.
So if there is a deal here between the U.S. and China, if we see more manufacturing brought here to the U.S., help me understand kind of the next chapter of this playbook. So there is the tariffs policy and the kind of vice that's putting on a lot of these companies. How is it going to lead to more kind of manufacturing jobs here in the U.S.? What's the catalyst going to be to see the development of more manufacturing jobs in the U.S.?
Well, it's already happening right now. The SBA has puts out about 1,000 small business loans to manufacturers about every 2 months. So we already see that engine churning. What we're focused on is a skilled workforce now. We have to ensure that we have that workforce coming on board to whether it's welding or understanding automation, the use of AI. I've been a big proponent of how this can impact our ability to onshore businesses that we couldn't even dream of. And I've walked factory floors with those small businesses that are mass producing components for OEMs, that are producing bicycles, and they don't need 1,000 employees. They need 50 to 100, and they're doing incredible things with CNC machining, automated welding, robotic welding, AI, and other things. But we have to take care of our educational needs at that foundational level. So once we get the capital flowing again, when the government reopens, then we'll focus on skilled workforce.
You're taking it right where I want to go, which is how the shutdown is affecting the work that you're doing. Why is it so difficult in this moment for those loans to go out to the American people who need them?
Well, sadly, this Democrat shutdown has really stung Main Street in the form of small business lending. Right now, as I mentioned, we had record loans volume. The momentum was very strong thanks to the tailwinds of the Trump economy. But now what we've seen is a total shutdown of SBA guaranteed lending, which is delivered through local community lenders to the tune of about 320 loans per day, not being able to be closed, for a total funding of $170 million that is not being delivered across main streets in this country. By the end of the week, that'll be $4 billion that's not getting to 6,000 small businesses. So it's really painful right now to small businesses, and we have to ensure that we get back to common sense that is used on Main Street and bring that back to Washington so that we can have those conversations and reopen the government.
Is there any way that changes absent congressional action? So I think of the work that Russ Vought at OMB has done to kind of move things around. I think he calls it playing budgetary twister to keep some programs up and running, keep some people getting paid. Is there anything that the administration can do to free the flow of those funds that you're talking about?
Well, I think they've been doing a tremendous job of it. It was a priority for the president, and he said this in our cabinet meeting a few weeks ago. I want to minimize the pain to the American people. It's in stark contrast to what Democrats have said, is that we want to use this pain as leverage. And the president has delivered pay for our military. He's found money for women, infants, and children feeding programs. We need to ensure, though, that this November 1st date that's coming up, 42 million people are not going to get their food stamps. Almost 7 million WIC payments won't go out. This is very painful for the American people, not to mention the million plus in our military, our federal government workers that are working hard that aren't getting paid. This has to end.
How are you thinking about that November 1st date? So you point out all of the people who are going to be under pressure then, and maybe this as a pressure point. If you're out talking to a manufacturer, he grabs your arm and says, when is this going to end? What is your best sense of sort of when that's going to be and where, if any, there are off-ramps to this in the near term?
Yeah, well, I was with Speaker Johnson this morning. He was very clear in that he would like this to end today. We would all like this to end today. And certainly small businesses, our military, mothers who have young children that they're trying to feed, we all want it to end. And I don't know what the off-ramp is, but Speaker Johnson is absolutely right to say it's not going to end in a smoke-filled room with 4 people deciding what that deal is. There's a clean CR on the table that Democrats have voted for 4 times. It's the Biden budget that they've passed over and over that now Democrats have voted 12 times to keep the government closed, to keep Main Street hurting, to keep our military unpaid. It's got to end sooner than later.
I'm going to ask you last about something unrelated. I live in New York. I was coming down here, and folks said, you got to check out the East Wing. What's going on with the East Wing? I know that you and your husband donated to the project, the ballroom project that President Trump is building. Could you talk a bit about sort of why you did that, first of all, and if what you're seeing unfold at the White House is in keeping with what you thought this project was going to be?
Well, I can speak for myself.
Sure.
I'm proud to be a longtime supporter of the president, and this is something that's historic. It's important for generations to come. It's important for our standing on a world stage, which this president is restoring single-handedly. Peace deals that we could have never imagined. Look at the trade deals he's undertaking to benefit Main Street America. And I couldn't be more proud to be with a group of donors that really cares about building. And I look at the other side of the aisle, and Democrats are tearing it down. They're burning it down. They're rioting in the streets. That's what Democrat donors are funding. And so I'm really proud to be on the right side here of building for the future, that a resource that people from all types, walks of life and parties can benefit from in the future. So I look forward to seeing what the president's going to do next. He's got a full plate over in Asia, and I know good things are going to come of that. And I hate to see that this is actually a topic right now when people are going hungry and needs aren't being met in this country simply because Democrats want to vote over and over to show how extreme left they are, how beholden they are to the socialist side of the party now that has gotten the endorsement of House leadership.
I got that list from the White House of who had donated, individuals and companies alike. Can you say how much you donated? Is that something you can reveal?
We haven't disclosed it, but I've been a significant donor to the president for a long time. I'm donating my time and my service now. I did that in the Senate. I donate my pay, and I believe public service is just a humbling thing to do, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity that the president's given me. I'm working really hard at the agency. We've turned it around, transformed it. We're creating a strong financial services platform for the federal government, for small businesses and taxpayers, and we're working through making it much more lean and efficient, and that already shows in our first-year results.
Kelly Loeffler, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, David.
Appreciate it. That's Kelly Loeffler, the administrator of the Small Business Administration, joining me here on set in Washington, D.C. Well, coming up, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent unveils the 5 contenders who could succeed Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Bring you those details. And President Trump says that he's open to meeting North Korea's Kim Jong-un during his Asia trip. We'll discuss with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm David Gura. We'll turn back to President Trump's trip to Asia in just a moment. But first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has confirmed the names of the 5 finalists set to succeed Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The candidate pool has been narrowed to current Fed board members Christopher Waller and Michelle Bowman, former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, the director of the National Economic Council Kevin Hassett, and BlackRock executive Rick Rieder. Bessent, who is leading interviews for the position, reiterated that he's planning to do a further round of interviews and hopes to present a good slate to President Trump after the Thanksgiving holiday, with the president saying he expects to make his decision by the end of the year. Some developing news we got earlier this hour: Google and NextEra Inc. announcing a nuclear energy pact. The company's announcing a plan that would restart a nuclear power plant in Iowa, primarily to supply Google data centers. The Duane Arnold Energy Center is expected to start delivering power by 2029, following agreements with Google. According to a statement, the 615-megawatt plant shut down in 2020, well before the AI boom that has now stoked demand for new power sources. Indiana Republican Governor Mike Braun is calling for a special session in his state, directing lawmakers to redraw the state's congressional districts, joining an increasing number of states doing the same thing. Braun's call expands what's become a national fight over redistricting. Of course, President Trump wants Republicans to maintain control of the U.S. House of Representatives. Democrats in several states are trying to offset that maneuver with their own redrawn maps. Republicans hold a supermajority in both chambers of the Indiana state legislature, making it likely the only 2 Democrats in its congressional delegation will be targeted. And more than 160,000 voters have already gone to the polls in New York City, shattering records as early voting began over the weekend, with Zoran Mamdani, Andrew Cuomo, and Curtis Sliwa battling it out in the final days of this campaign. Mamdani got a big boost from Democratic firebrands like Bernie Sanders and AOC as thousands of ralliers reveled in the campaign glow of Mamdani's closing message.
Oligarchs of New York are the wealthiest people in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. They do not want the equation to change.
Joining me now with their reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan-Zaino, Democracy Visiting Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Jeannie is here with Republican strategist Matt Gorman, Chief Communications Officer at Targeted Victory. Matt, let me start with you and just get your perspective on what we're seeing unfold in New York. Andrew Cuomo making a run at it here, but the event last night, 13,000 people showed up at Forest Hills Stadium. What do you, as a Republican, kind of take from that, the level of enthusiasm that he's been able to capture here over the course of this campaign?
I'm glad I'm not living in New York City, I'll put it that way. Look,
we would love to have you there, I must say.
No, look, the time for Cuomo to mount any sort of effort would have been about 2-3 months ago when this actually mattered. I think it is far too late to do any meaningful change. My only question really is if Mamdani gets to 50% or not. But look, I think you're seeing an energy in the Democratic Party that Bernie had in 16 and in 20, and being carried on through Mamdani and AOC, who knows, maybe in 2028 as well. That's where the energy and at least the money and power for the left is.
What he's really seized on is this issue of affordability. Yeah. And how do Republicans respond to that? Let's say not in New York, but outside of New York. If that's going to be kind of a resonant message of Republicans going forward here, how do Republicans respond?
Well, I think he provides, a good kind of totem, if you will, or an example that we can point to over the next year or so of, look, we understand cost of living is an issue, certainly during the Biden years, but, do you want to have, free busing and all of this stuff by simply taxing people into oblivion? And eventually you start running out of other people's money. I think you're going to see a lot more of him in midterms ads that Republicans can use as a cudgel.
Jeannie, is that going to be effective? I mean, I look at that stage there. You have, again, AOC, Senator Sanders, who have been held up by this movement for a very long time here. Is he now the third person in that trifecta? Sort of what's his role going to be here going forward? What's the longer-term ramifications of this race going to be for Democrats?
Yeah, I think a lot of us look at the New York City race, obviously Virginia, New Jersey governor races as precursors to what we may see going forward. I think we have to hesitate a little bit about that. You and I both live in New York, yes, David. Sorry. We know that it is not representative of the entire nation, but I think it does speak, and the energy that Matt was just talking about, it does speak to the fact that not just on the far left, but Democrats broadly, Republicans broadly, they want these critical issues addressed. Cost of living, health care. I mean, we are talking about people next week receiving letters that their health care is going to quadruple. I mean, that is a stunning number. And so I think he is on to that. And I think he also has this authenticity thing down.
Will he be the face of the party? Will Republicans be able or effective in doing that, do you think?
It's a big party. It can be multi-faced. Is that a word?
Multi-faced, multifaceted. There you go.
Abigail Spanberger, right? Mikey Sherrill. We can't just have one person, but I think Republicans are going to try. I think Donald Trump is holding his fire until this election is over.
Is concluded.
And then it's going to be socialist, communist, Democrats all over.
Okay. Matt, let me ask you about the news we've been tracking out of Asia, and we had this deal, this framework agreement that was reached by the Treasury Secretary and his counterparts on the Chinese side. He had an exchange with Martha Raddatz on This Week on ABC. He said, I was surprised. He says he's a soybean farmer. I was surprised in the area. What do you make of that? And this has been an issue where I think there's been some suggestion that this might be the thing that opens up these shutdown talks, that you have farmers who are really struggling here. Absent that, is that a hindrance to these being resolved?
I think a couple things. Well, first thing, when it comes to soybeans, I am actually more bullish on a smaller deal related to agriculture around China. We'll see if the trade agreement that's more broad-based comes to pass.
So you're saying take a measured approach when you think about how this is going to go on
Thursday? Yes, at the very least, we'll come out of this with something, I believe, on soybeans, agriculture, a small win at the very, very least. When it comes to the shutdown, I think the most important thing out of the day was the Federal Employees Union coming out with a big statement this morning relating to calling on Democrats to kind of end this. And I think you even saw Dick Durbin didn't change his position, but he was a little bit more measured and when he was addressed with this statement in news conferences today.
I referenced this earlier, but Lisa Murkowski up on Capitol Hill saying we have to stay here, we have to forego payments, we have to talk with one another. That seems like an even higher hurdle for a lot of these lawmakers to mount.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. Reopen the government first. It was the same thing we felt when Ted Cruz and Republicans shut down the government in 2013. We'll talk about it. We'll negotiate, but you got to pass the clean CR, reopen the government.
Jeannie, sticking with trade here for a moment. Yes, there's been this success. You can debate how large a success it is in Asia, but you look at what's going on between the U.S. and Canada. I watched the second game of the World Series and saw this ad that clearly got in the crawl of President Trump. What do you make of this continuing, this kind of confusing and disorienting back and forth between the U.S. and Canada, the neighbor to the north?
It really gives lie to what Donald Trump has said. I mean, he is going to the Supreme Court right now and saying he has to have the power to impose these tariffs because it's an emergency. Well, what that emergency turned out to be over the weekend was an advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan that he didn't like, and so now he's raised those tariffs 10%. You know, the raising of tariffs belongs to Congress. That is their job. They raise revenue. All revenue starts in the House. That's Article 1. So I think this is very problematic and sort of encompasses the problem with his tariff regime overall, which is Ronald Reagan's point at that time was, if you're going to do it, it should be limited, it should be targeted, it should not be a worldwide tariff regime against our allies.
Matt, let me have you respond to this, because you read that Truth Social post from the president. What he's saying is the Canadians, or I guess the Ontario premier, was trying to influence the Supreme Court. Picking up what Jeannie said, doesn't seem like a very salient national security argument. If anything, kind of blowing a hole in the argument that you have the administration trying to make here before the court in a few days.
I'm bearish on the idea that IEEPA, which is the basis for these tariffs, is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, because that would also undo not just a tariff authority, but, say, Iranian sanctions, Russian sanction authority that we've had for 40, 45 years. I will say this, though, and Jeannie and I were talking about this before. I advise a lot of corporate clients that have work around to the administration. You have to be so careful. You cannot, if you're in high stakes, tense negotiations with the president, you can't have some outside quasi-government force then bombing. I've seen unconfirmed reports, $53 million of advertising on this. You have to be buttoned up. You have to go in this with a plan. Stray kind of things on the outside can only hurt you. You have to be very, very careful.
Jeannie, let me ask you lastly here, maybe picking up on that, sort of what are companies to do trying to navigate this world?
It is so difficult. I mean, as Matt said, we were just talking about this. I do a lot of political risk teaching, and how you manage risk in this environment. I can't tell you how many people ask, what is going to happen? And of course, we don't know. So the answer is you have to do the best you can to protect what's most valuable to you and to try to have a plan. God forbid something goes awry. And on the point of that ad, of course, it's certainly what the Prime Minister of Canada has been trying to do, is to manage the risk of this ad that came out of Ontario.
Just a couple seconds left, but what are you watching for on Thursday in terms of an outcome from these talks? You said you're kind of a measured perspective on it.
I think at the very least we're going to get something on soybeans, agriculture. If we can get a bigger deal, great. I think at the very least we'll leave something with something that Trump can say is a win, and we see that with corporations too.
You want to respond to that as well? What are you watching for here on Thursday?
Yeah, I think we'll get a deal on soybeans now that we know that Scott Bessent is a soybean farmer. Who knew?
Noted soybean farmer Scott Bessent of South Carolina, the gentleman from South Carolina. Thanks to both of you. Really appreciate it. Matt Gorman joining me here on set in Washington, D.C. Jeannie Sheehan-Zaino as well. To learn more about all these stories and more, make sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And, of course, our coverage of the president's trip to Asia continues. We'll have coverage through the night into tomorrow as President Trump is scheduled to meet with the Prime Minister of Japan before he makes his way to South Korea for that pivotal meeting we were just discussing between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. I'm David Gura, and this is Bloomberg. We'll see you tomorrow.